All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As we close out the first quarter of 2026, obviously there are a number of economic signals worth paying attention to, from inflation to energy prices to labor challenges to consumer spending. And so today's goal is pretty simple for us. We want to try to provide a little clarity on what's happening and what it could mean for you and each of us. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Chris Kuehl, Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. Chris is with us today. He provides economic forecasts and strategic guidance to organizations around the world and presents to more than 125 groups each year. I've had the honor of listening to Chris over the years in several presentations, and he's going to do a fantastic job for us today. But he's got a unique ability to break down the complex trends into practical insight. So, Chris, welcome for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, very good. I appreciate that. And I think I am sharing. Let's see. Here we go. Ta-da. So, can't speak without slides. It's actually illegal in most states for an economist to speak without slides. So we're going to stay true to the profession. I appreciate the introduction. This is when you're an economist, you learn pretty quickly that no matter what you say, within about 2 hours, it will change. One of my favorite definitions of an economist is someone who explains tomorrow why the predictions they made yesterday didn't come true today. And there's been a lot of that. My other favorite quote is from J.K. Galbraith, who points out that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. So, 2026 economic outlook, at least for today. We'll see what it is tomorrow. I also like to kind of reference one of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, and that will tell you a lot about my economic orientation. Because the issue that has been hovering over the economy literally all year and did all last year as well is inflation. And as Friedman points out, inflation is the one form of taxation that can be imposed without legislation. Because what it boils down to is that it really is a tax on anything. I mean, inflation is by far more feared by economists than recession. When you have a recession, you are always going to have exceptions to the rule. There are going to be companies that do pretty well during a recession, and there are those that, of course, get absolutely crushed by it. No matter how bad it gets in an economy, there are be sectors that do pretty well. One of the groups, for example, that I speak to almost every year is the Casket and Funeral Supply Association. So during the pandemic, everybody was in bad shape. I mean, it was a horrendous downturn. We had one of the smallest growth periods we'd had in decades. The casket and funeral supply people did very well that year. So you just had to be in the right position. Inflation, on the other hand, kills everybody. And that's one of the reasons that you get a lot of focus on it from the Fed level. So getting into some of the brass tacks about where we are economically, the first quarter GDP numbers have been kind of bouncing around. We were for a while looking at some pretty robust numbers. We were even looking at something close to 3 or 4%, but it has been waffling back and forth, probably sitting around 2.5% now, depending on sort of some of the data collection that's taking place. This is January, February, March. So we don't know exactly for sure what Q1 is going to be until we've assessed the numbers from this month. What was throwing it off for a while was the kind of on again, off again concerns around travel and the government shutdown. We don't know how big an impact that's going to have. It was really accelerating a couple of weeks ago, and now seems to be calming down a bit. But suffice it to say, we're probably in comfortable territory. We generally grow at around 2.5, 2.6%. That's been our 20-year average. So we're about close to that. However, if you looked back to last year, we had a couple of quarters, second and third, that were well above norm. We were seeing 3 to 4% growth in the second quarter, getting up almost close to 5% in the third quarter. fell off pretty dramatically in fourth quarter. Again, government shutdown data, etc. The point that I really want to make, though, is where that growth is coming from, and it's coming almost exclusively from consumer spending. No surprise there. This is a consumer-oriented country. It has always been what has driven GDP. But what's interesting about it is you've had kind of a flip in the last several years to have more emphasis on services and less on goods. So we're still buying a lot of stuff, we're still consuming, but an awful lot of the consumer spending is now oriented towards services, and we can thank the boomer for that. The boomer has reached the point in their economic life where they have most of what they want. I mean, they have a house, they have a car, they have toys, they're ready to go. Now they're spending their money on services. They're paying people to do things they don't want to do. Don't want to shovel snow anymore, don't want to mow the yard anymore, don't want to do anything anymore. I want someone else to do that. And so they have disposable income, so they spend it on services. They also spend a great deal of money on healthcare, and healthcare is in the service category. And they may not want to spend that much money on healthcare. This is not exactly the most fun way to distribute your income, but it's driving a lot of what's going on in the economy. There's a lot of conversation still around tariffs and what they mean, what they will mean. It's been a little bit confusing all year. No big surprise because it came in rather suddenly at the beginning of this last year, and it's taken the better part of the year to kind of figure out what the rules are. Right from the very beginning, there was a kind of a legal challenge to the system that was being deployed to put tariffs in place. The Supreme Court eventually said what all the other courts had said, which is that you cannot use the IEEPA to impose these blanket tariffs. It was not set up to do that. It's not the appropriate tool. The Supreme Court did not rule against tariffs in general. Tariffs are like the oldest trick in the book in terms of protecting domestic production. They used to be referred to as infant industry tariffs. They were kind of designed when your country was just starting to do something. There were lots of competitors around the world. You wanted to give your domestic competitors a bit of an edge for a while so that you would give them some protection whenever they got grown up and they could compete, then you would reduce the tariffs. But even beyond that, if you look at the history of tariffs in this country, we had very, very low tariffs post World War II. And we did that deliberately. We were the only country standing. We were trying to rebuild Europe, Japan, stuff, and making us more successful, which is exactly what happened in the 50s and 60s. We had no competition from anywhere. I mean, you think about some of the products that were coming in at that point. Cars, Japanese cars, who the heck was worried about Japanese cars in the 50s and 60s? Nobody. I mean, they were horrible little things. But times change. And instead of Ford, GM, and Chrysler being the top three, now we're looking at Honda, Toyota, and Hyundai. So the reason for having really low tariffs on the rest of the world kind of expired. And so it became incumbent upon us to be a little bit more protective, or maybe a lot more protective, of our own production. So what you're now seeing at the federal level is looking at different ways to impose tariffs, and there's lots of them. And we've got trade acts that go back to the 19 teens, and all of these can be put into place. The challenge is that they all have certain restrictions. There are some of them that are limited by the number of days. There are some that are limited by how high the tariff can go. There are some that are limited by whether or not they need an investigation before you can impose the tariff. The reason the IEEPA was chosen was that it didn't require any of that. And so we could do it very fast. Now it's like, nope, nope, have to go back and do it the slow way. And so we're seeing some of that going on. The big impact immediately is that those who paid tariffs during that early period are now due a refund. because that tariff was ruled illegal. So now there's this big conversation about who's going to get the refund and how's it going to happen. I personally am referring to this as the Attorney Protection Act of 2026. I mean, this is going to be dragging through the courts for a long time. So, given all that, what's in the Fed's head right now? Well, good question. This is a fairly communicative Fed, but it still keeps its cards close to its vest. We're looking at GDP probably around 2.3, 2.5% for 26. Now, that could go up. It depends. It also could go down. The employment situation looks fairly steady, but there's a lot of concern about that, which we'll talk about in a minute. Inflation still fairly tame. All of this, though, is kind of up in the air, and you heard that when the Fed met last. The Fed's focus is always inflation, the number one thing it worries about. It technically has a dual mandate. But in truth, the most important thing is inflation, and it is going to work at inflation issues more so than it works at stimulating the economy. Because quite frankly, it's not the most effective tool for stimulation. I mean, all the Fed can do is make money a little more accessible. It can lower interest rates. It can change the reserve ratio. It can do things that promote lending. That's not direct. If you really want to goose the economy and get it moving in a direction that is positive, well, you have to throw money at it. And that's what Congress is set up to do. So whenever you've seen a circumstance where the economy needs a sudden boost, well, it comes from spending and it comes from cutting taxes. It's like get more money in people's pockets. Either don't tax them very much or send them money directly. The Fed is kind of a secondary player when it comes to stimulating. On the other hand, when you're trying to control growth, when you're trying to control inflation, politicians hate doing that because that means slowing the economy down. It means raising taxes and it means cutting spending. The Fed can do it more effectively by manipulating rates. So, we're probably going to see another rate cut, but I don't think it's going to happen until sometime in the summer. But a lot of it's going to depend on what happens with oil and all the excitement going on in the Middle East right now. So right now, the inflation rate is still more or less under control. The Fed looks at the very last line on this chart, the 12-month PCE inflation trimmed mean. And all that really means is that there are lots of different ways to look at inflation. You will periodically see things like the consumer price index and the producer price index. Those come out every month. They're very useful, but they're predominantly speculative. They're based on estimates, they're based on algorithms, they're based on assumptions, because we don't have all the data yet. When you go to PCE, which is personal consumption expenditures, much more accurate than CPI or PPI, but it lags. If you look at this chart, this is data from the end of January. We're at the end of March. We've got a couple of months that we don't really know what the inflation rate was because we don't have the data yet. It takes a while to actually figure out what we spent it on, and what the rate is. But that's what the Fed will look at. So when the Fed's looking at inflation, trying to decide what they're going to do with rates, they're looking at data that's about 2 months old, and it's perpetually 2 months old. So by the end of April, they'll be looking at numbers that came from February. So right now, if you look at the beginning of the year, we're in pretty good shape inflation-wise. We've been sitting at about 2.5, 2.6 for the better part of a year. Fed would like it to be at 2%, but if it's at 2.4, it's not a crisis. So here's one of the things that has made predicting the economy a little bit challenging. We're in the middle of what's being referred to as a K-shaped recovery. And it's kind of unusual. We don't get this very often, but it's pretty persistent. We've had it now for several years. What you see is an upper income level, those making over 100K a year, and you see a middle level from about 50K to 100K, and then you have a lower level which is under 50K. All three of those groups of consumers are behaving very differently. The upper income group is still spending like they always did, if not more aggressively. They have money. A lot of their money came from the markets, and they're not feeling pinched. They're acknowledging inflation. They don't ignore it, but it hasn't really changed their spending habits. The lower third has been rocked by inflation. They don't have the wherewithal. They're turning to credit cards to pay for necessities. They, for all intents and purposes, checked out of the economy. They don't have much latitude. A lot of eyes on the middle. The middle continues to spend if their jobs are secure. And this is where the employment issue becomes critical. About half of those people are in very comfortable positions when it comes to jobs. We are dealing with a nationwide labor shortage in the middle of having unemployment issues. It's just the fact that we have jobs that require skills that we're not producing. There's lots of different conversations around what happens in 2030. You've heard the economists talk about the mother of all recessions in 2030. They're not really predicting a recession in that time frame because frankly we can't. I mean, we can barely predict the next Tuesday, much less 2030. But what we do know is going to happen in 2030 is a demographic collapse. In 2030, every single boomer will have finally reached retirement age. That's 76 million people that will be eligible for retire. Now, being boomers, we don't retire. We don't have lives, so we just keep working. We work into our 60s, we work into our 70s. Heck, we even work into our 80s. But at some point, we wake up and say, I want to enjoy my golden weeks. So we end up seeing people start to retire. The people that are retiring have the skills that are not necessarily being developed elsewhere. And I work a lot with manufacturers. I work a lot with people in construction. I work a lot with people in the transportation sector. Their skilled people are retiring, and there's nobody to take those jobs. So as those people retire, you have a labor crisis trying to find people who can fill the jobs from people who've retired. And it's affecting healthcare. I mean, healthcare is just another sector that's seen that kind of retirement surge. Those people are immune. Those people who have those jobs are in good shape. However, there's a whole category of people who are being challenged by technology, whether it's robotics or AI or anything that is changing how people do things. And we'll talk more about AI here in a minute. But you've got this bifurcated recovery. People in the upper income doing great, people in the lower doing horribly, people in the middle it can go either way. Some of them may start to get up towards the upper income, others start to fall behind. So we're beginning to see a little bit of pressure on that upper end just because of the behavior of the markets as they are worrying about where the next shoe drops. The war, the oil crisis, all of that, we've seen it. We've been seeing the markets getting into correction territory, a lot of concern about what happens. The price per barrel has crested over $100, hasn't done that for years. We now see gasoline at the pumps over $4 at a national level. Haven't seen that in years either. And we don't know when this ends. I don't want to reiterate and beat that to death. We're seeing it every day. But the bottom line is that we have a weird situation when it comes to oil. There is no shortage of oil globally. As a matter of fact, 2 months ago, the big concern was that we had too much oil. And the price per barrel, according to the Energy Information Agency, was in danger of falling to as low as 45 or $50 a barrel. Now that sounds great, except that it doesn't really translate into prices at the pump. The problem is that when it falls below 50, actually below 60, it's almost impossible for American oil producers to compete. So if you're in Texas or Oklahoma or North Dakota or Wyoming, you need that price per barrel up over 60. and it was threatening to fall well below that. The last time we hit that was the Houston recession back in 2015, I think. So we're not worrying about that right now, but that's still the overarching issue. There is still way too much oil in the world for the demand. The trouble we're running into is transportation. We can't get the oil from where it's being produced and refined to where it's needed. It's the whole issue of the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea and all the rest of it. What makes that challenging is that if it was an oil shortage situation, it would take months for that to come under change. I mean, it would take a while to start producing. We've got the oil. The issue is now, can we transport it? Quite literally, the oil crisis could end in a day. If the straits were suddenly opened up, if we found a way to protect oil tankers, if Iran decided not to attack them, etc., the situation would change overnight, and you'd have markets reacting and all the rest. At the moment, there's no sign of that. So that's what's got the markets very concerned. It is nearly impossible to escort ships through that strait because it's so narrow, and the Iranians can attack it with almost anything. The key issue for transportation of those tankers is insurance. The insurance industry will not cover shipments through that region. I mean, they're on the hook. If there is a ship that gets hit, and it's not just the fact that the ship gets damaged. A few months ago, there was a tanker that was trying to get through the Red Sea, and the Houthi were attacking it. Well, it was escorted by an American destroyer, a British destroyer. It had all the protection you can want, and it comes under a drone attack, and the two destroyers shot down, I think, like 99% of the drones. One got through, punched a hole in the tanker, and of course it leaked oil all over the place. That's what the insurance companies are fearful of. They're on the hook for the oil spill. So it's not a matter of do we have enough ships, it's a matter of the insurance companies going, I'm not touching this until there's more security. So we're seeing pretty decent personal income numbers. They're not horrible. They're kind of getting back to what we have seen in the past. We've had really bad years. 2022 was a bad year as far as disposable personal income. We're kind of in the middle. We're predicting around 2.9%. 2019, it was around 3.1. So there is money out there. Like I said, it's kind of concentrated in the upper third. Kind of mentioned the labor wave already. We are expecting probably around 4 million AI-related job losses, maybe a million in terms of improved or new jobs. Still leaves a loss of around 3 million. Boomer retirements, this is the critical thing, 22 million boomer retirements versus 2.3 new entrants. That is a big gap. That's a nearly 20 million gap. So where will those people come from? You know, will we see changes in immigration policy? Will we see more use of robotics and AI because we can't find people? Right now, manufacturers, the number one way that they're recruiting, all the ones that I talk to, dragging people out of retirement. I was talking to a guy not long ago who said, I was pretty excited, just hired a new machinist. He was the younger of the two. He was only 77. Holy cow. I mean, you're in a situation where you're dragging people into their 70s and 80s back to work because you can't find replacements. Consumer sentiment has gotten weaker because of this. There's worry among consumers around inflation, obviously, around layoffs, obviously. But one of the interesting things about American consumers, we can hold our heads up high. Every other country in the world, if they face any kind of economic or financial distress, they get conservative. They get cautious. They get frugal. They start to worry about their jobs. They worry about the money they have. The American consumer has the attitude that if I'm going to get fired and if I'm going to lose my job, well, I'd better buy the big screen TV now because I won't have money for it later. And that way, if I lose my job and don't have any money, at least I've got something to watch. We tend to spend as we get closer to a recession. We have quite literally spent our way out of 7 recessions in the last 30 or 40 years, where we were headed for one, all the signs were pushing it, and then all of a sudden we went nuts and bought cars and TVs and whatever else we wanted to buy because we were afraid we couldn't afford it later. So every country in the world is like, how do you grow consumers like that? It's like, well, we just like to spend. That's part of the reason that you've seen some increase in small business sentiment. Because even as people have gotten concerned about where the economy is growing, they're spending. And so the small business community is seeing the result of that. These next few graphs are from Armada. We developed this about 4 or 5 years ago. And I don't want to brag, but I'm going to anyway. These have been tracking at like 97, 98% accuracy, quarter after quarter, month after month. I would like to take full credit for this, but I can't. We have a model builder who is a retired lieutenant colonel who was in the artillery prior to leaving the military. And he said in his old job, accuracy was really, really, really important. And he developed a very sophisticated multivariate system to track his ordnance. He now uses that same system to track the economy. So you get that graph on the left. The orange line is our prediction. And then we have lines to the north and south, which will indicate changes in those variables. So if the invariable that we're looking at, there's like 26 in this set. If that variable improves, we get the line to the north. If that variable doesn't improve, we get the line to the south. But when you look at that line, even the not favorable variable scenario, it's still growing. You still see consumer retail spending growing, even when things are not tracking in a positive direction. If you look at the graph on the right, we've been so far above trend line for 5 years now. And still, I mean, you go all the way back to the 2008, 2009 recession, we've left that in the dust. We completely recovered from the pandemic recession and just kept going. So retail trade is still very strong. And like I said, it's been driven predominantly by that upper third and about half of the middle third, but it's still pounding along. And we're still getting that same performance because we're looking out ahead literally to the end of this year, early 27, and it's still growing. If you look at corporate spending, again, still growing. It's trending back up again. A lot of this has been driven by predictable projects around data centers, around transportation. You're even getting some pretty solid contributions from healthcare. All of this has been tech related. You've got companies that are either on the cutting edge of tech or trying to catch up. And so we're seeing a lot of expansion of robotics, of trying to find ways to compensate for loss of labor, etc. So we're seeing a lot of traditional expansion in areas like machinery and manufacturing, but a great deal of the acceleration is coming off of this kind of stuff, data centers. So we look at non-residential construction, another one of our graphs, growing, growing fast. I mean, we had almost exponential growth for a couple of years after the pandemic. And then it slowed down. This was predominantly growth in the transportation sector, which then slowed down. Now it's picking up when it comes to data centers and healthcare. And it's tracking high. I mean, our predictions are by the middle of next year, we're back on considerable growth curve. And this is good news for an awful lot of sectors of the economy. We work with a lot of construction companies, and they're anticipating some pretty good work. It depends, of course, on where you are in the country. So there's opportunities predominantly in the Midwest and the Southeast, to a certain degree in the Southwest, less opportunity in the Northeast and Far West, particularly when you start looking at the residential market, which we'll do in a minute. A lot of conversation about what happens in the residential market, and the most important determinant is the 10-year bond market. A lot of hue and cry when the Fed was messing around with interest rates because there was this notion that, well, if the interest rates fell, this was going to stimulate mortgage activity. It really doesn't. Mortgages don't pay a lot of attention to the Fed rate. They do a little more on the commercial side, but what the mortgage market pays attention to is the 10-year bond. And the 4% is the psychological threshold. If it gets below 4%, you begin to see real movement. And it's no magic thing. It's not really hooked to anything, but it's just 3.5% to 4% is kind of the pop figure. And once it gets into that local, you see a lot of mortgage activity. It briefly dropped below 4% for a bit, and you instantly saw more refinancing, you saw more new markets, you saw a lot of activity, and that was directly tied to what was happening with that 10-year bond. When we look at our own forecast for residential, we're seeing good solid growth going into the rest of this year, tailing off towards the end of this year and into next. But when you look at the graph on the right, you see it looks like an EKG. I mean, it's always bouncing all over the place because so many things affect residential. One of the big drivers for residential right now has been shifting, where people are leaving high cost, high tax states to go to low cost, low tax states. There was a study done a few years ago that was just asking the simple question, how much would you have to make as a single person in every state in the union to live a comfortable, quote, life? Well, to live that life in California, you would need to make $200,000 a year as a single person. To live that same comfortable life in North Dakota, you would need to make 50,000. And so now you have a circumstance where Fargo is one of the faster growing cities in the United States because people are like, hey, I don't need to be in California. I don't need to be in New York. I just want to live a comfortable life. I think I'll try North Dakota. I have a friend that just retired there, 75 years old, and people thought he was nuts. And he said, well, I'm 75. I don't like sun that much anymore. I don't care about the ocean, whatever. What I like to do is bowl, and I like to swim, and I like to watch movies. And somebody built a house up here with an indoor swimming pool, an indoor bowling alley, and a little indoor theater. And even though I know it's going to be 75 degrees below zero and 200 feet of snow, I got the house for $400,000, and I'm just going to spend the winter bowling and swimming and watching movies. And it came with 2 snowmobiles. So what else do I need? It's crazy. I'm the economist for the North Dakota Society of CPAs. And when I go up to talk to these guys, they're like, you wouldn't believe the boom that we've been experiencing unrelated to oil. We're used to having an oil boom, but now it's just people are like, no, it's, I can appreciate living here. I'm from Kansas. Kansas has been seeing some of this growth too, because it's cheaper. I mean, you can live a comfortable life in Kansas for about 70,000 a year. You look at Tennessee, Kentucky, 75 to 80. So you've got people saying, I can live a really nice life in some parts of the country for half of what it would cost me to live in other parts. So manufacturing has been doing quite well. I mean, it has been growing at a level that we haven't seen in a while and continues to. We see a little bit of a dip in early 2017, but then it bounces right back. And the manufacturing numbers are still not quite back to where they were prior to the pandemic, but they're healthy and healthier than we expected them to be. This has a lot to do with the reshoring phenomena that's been going on now for several years. Kind of got accelerated by the tariff conversation, but not quite as much as anticipated. The reshoring stuff had been taking place long before the tariffs because doing business overseas had gotten expensive. If you were doing stuff in China, in India, in anywhere, well, transportation costs have gone up, Chinese wages have gone up, and it just became expensive. So companies are like, well, whatever advantage I once had by doing this business overseas, I've basically lost. So I think I'll go back home. I'm closer to my customer. I've got more control over my operation. Doing business overseas from a management, it's tough. I mean, it's an entirely different world. So you've seen a lot of manufacturing come back to the U.S. The biggest holdup when you talk to manufacturers is labor. They said, look, we'll come back in a heartbeat if you have people we can hire. Quit sending people to useless college degrees and put more of them in trade schools. Not that I'm dogging on college. I used to be a professor, but right now the need is for people that have these skills, and we've been kind of neglect in terms of developing that. Computer and electronics manufacturing, what a shock. That's been growing. Can't imagine why. So we continue to see a lot of growth. It's at the trend line and above, and that's simply going to accelerate. We know AI has taken a big chunk of that growth, but so is robotics. I mean, it's been predicted that by 2030, 1 in every 3 households is going to have a domestic robot. It's going to be cooking and cleaning and taking care of the household, particularly if the household has boomers in it. Well, we're getting older and our mobility isn't what it used to be, and we're a lot interested in having assistance and help, and in some cases, a lot of assistance and help. So the robot is playing a much, much bigger role, and it's becoming a lot more common in all kinds of other contexts. I mean, I was just in the healthcare sector at one point. I was dealing with back injuries. I won't go into this, but I fall out of bed in the middle of the night. The nurse who's on duty is a charming woman, but she's from Thailand and she weighs like 80 pounds. She's not going to get me in bed. She calls in a robot who picks me up, puts me back in bed, pulls the covers over my shoulders, taps on the head, and says good night. It's like, are you kidding me? So I'm talking to the people at the hospital, and they said, look, the number one way that nurses get hurt is trying to move patients back into bed. So we've developed this robot, which she controls, that can do that job and keep her from being hurt. All of that's driving this computer and electronic manufacturing growth. We have tried to look at different sectors of the economy and gauge growth. We have the typical green, yellow, red. Rapid growth, modest growth in green, a little bit of stalling, sometimes flat, and then some contractions. We don't see really any red right now. If you look at overall growth potential, it's in the yellow. It's kind of solidly in the yellow. It's not in the stall category, kind of drifting a little bit that direction, but huge growth in data centers through this year into next. Huge growth in power generation, which goes along with those data centers. They need the energy. And then you get pretty significant growth in healthcare. So healthcare is continuing to grow through 27, education growing through 26. Slows down a little bit in 27. But note, none of these categories are in the red. And none of them are even in the seriously stressed yellow. So we're seeing a lot of expansion in pretty significant sectors, distribution, commercial, the whole 9 yards, even housing. So global manufacturing has been a lot more stable. This is the Purchasing Managers Index, one of the few indices that you can actually trust, because purchasing managers don't know enough to lie. So if you ask them a question, you get a straight answer. They come back and say, yeah, I'm buying more, buying less, buying the same. If they're buying more, they're expecting growth. If they're buying less, they're not. As recently as January, you had 9 countries that were in contraction. Now there are only 4. As recently as last November, there were 15 in contraction. Now there's only 4. So almost the entire world now is expansion. Anything over 50 is expansion. Anything under is contraction. The Eurozone went from contraction to expansion. We've only seen a little bit of distress in places like Mexico. Mexico has been affected by a lot of the tariff conversation. Brazil has been affected by some of the tariff conversation. Russia has shot itself in the foot. But everybody else is seeing growth. Not crazy growth. I mean, we're still looking at numbers that are low 50s, but pointing in the right direction. Global supply chain pressures have been marginal. We're starting to see that perk up because of the oil situation, but it's still not as bad as it was when the Panama Canal wasn't working and the Red Sea was completely shut down. There's quite a bit more movement taking place, but that could start to get constrained as the price of fuel begins to affect the container fleets. The Iran war aftermath, we don't know. Is there going to be a surge followed by a plummeting in oil prices? That's one of the scenarios that once this is opened up, however it's opened up, does that mean this flood of oil hits all at once and reminds us that we have a glut? So is it a circumstance where we go from frying pan to fire, where it's like, okay, we can move oil now, but now it's collapsing the price per barrel and it's going to make it hard for Americans to compete. We don't know what increased production out of Iraq is going to look like. We don't know exactly what we're seeing out of Venezuela yet. So there's a lot of speculation, a lot of scenarios. I'm the red team economist for the U.S. military, and they're gaming this out every day, trying to figure out, okay, what happens if, what happens if, what happens if, because they don't really have a clear sense of what the exit strategy is going to be. Do we get capitulation out of Iran? Do we get negotiation out of Iran? Is there a new leadership? If it is, what does it look like? All of those are still kind of questions in the air. We could see some chip reaction. There's a lot of stuff coming out of the Middle East that figures into chip production. We not only get oil from that area, we get helium, we get bromine, we get all sorts of stuff that goes into chip production. And the sectors that will be hitting the most pressure, parts of construction, automotive, that sort of thing. So the chip issue, which was a big one 2 or 3, 4 years ago, is now kind of resurfacing. Could be as bad as what we got through in 2021 and 2022. Um, Last couple of slides, and we're going to take some time for questions. We're seeing delinquencies pretty much under control. I mean, if you look at what we were going through in 08, 09, that was crisis. That was miserable. Everything was going nuts. You know, credit cards were out of control, mortgages were out of control. That's why that was such a miserable recession. Going to today, we're not really seeing a crisis in mortgages. We're not seeing a crisis in revolving loans. We're not even really seeing one in auto loans. They're up a little bit, but not as much as they had. The only thing that's out of control are student loans, which is no surprise. And we're seeing a lot more stress with credit cards, but even that has leveled off just a bit. It leveled off high, which is not a good thing, but we're seeing the credit card issue predominantly with that lower third of income earners. And then I said I was going to talk a little bit about AI, and this is my last slide, I promise. A lot of conversation about where we are on the Gartner hype cycle. Gartner has been watching technology movements for a long time, and we are coming off of what's been referred to as the peak of inflated expectations. So they're kind of predicting that we're about halfway down that line towards the trough of disillusionment. So we get really excited about something and we're like, God, this is going to change the entire world and I'm going to turn over my entire life to AI. And then we discover, yeah, it's not that great. It does some things really well and it does things really badly. And then we go through this disillusioning phase. But coming out of the trough of disillusionment, we have the slope of enlightenment where we begin to realize what it can do and what it can't do. And then we hit the kind of the holy grail, the plateau of productivity. So we get to a point where we know what it can do, we know what it can't do, we know how to use it, and we begin to sort of integrate it into our life. We're not there yet. We're kind of coming off of that high. Probably will have an impact on the markets. Some of the disillusionment you're starting to see show up in market investment already. So, in summary, bifurcated economy, hard to stimulate the bottom, need to keep the top end moving. Machinery is in place for rate cuts. We'll have to see what the Fed decides to do. We have lots of growth in the U.S. economy, but it's concentrated. The rest of the economy is a little bit sluggish, and then we're just watching the supply chain. And with that, I will shut up and take questions. If you just can't get enough of this, this is my publication. Our publication comes out 3 times a week and sells for the same price as a Starbucks caramel macchiato. So with that, I turn it over to questions.
Dr. Kuehl, thank you very much for that. I think that was definitely a timely presentation and very, very insightful, very helpful. So, as Dr. Kuehl said, we've got a few minutes left for any questions. So, if you have any questions, if you want to put those in the chat, Alexis will be monitoring that. But Dr. Kuehl, one question we did get is, so if oil prices, you mentioned oil prices being over $100 a barrel, if they hit the 125 mark. What is your prediction on what that does to our inflation currently?
Yeah, that would be kind of the worst case scenario. We're not really expecting it to hit that level or at least not stay there very long, but we don't know for sure because if you get a lot more damage to the facilities there, it could jump up that. Remember that oil is a traded commodity. These are world market prices and the markets are volatile, if nothing else. So if it gets to 125, we're probably seeing enough inflationary push to even start to convince central banks to raise rates rather than lower them. We would see an instant reaction on the part of consumers because it would cascade into the price of fuel. We have been protected when it comes to inflation by the fact that fuel prices have been down and we've not had to deal with that. Food prices up, rent's up, mortgage rates were up, but fuel was down. If fuel suddenly it gets added to that, then we have issues. So we're seriously hoping that it doesn't get that high. Right now, as I checked it today, little over 100, still has a way to go before it gets that 125 mark.
Thank you. Let's see. One more here that we've got. What will the 2030 demographic cliff mean?
Yeah, I mentioned that briefly before. That's when we suddenly have this potential to see a significant part of the labor force exit. We already have pretty low workforce participation, like low 60s. And the reason for that, of course, is retirement. I mean, it's basically people that are leaving the workforce because they can. When we don't have replacements for them, we end up having two issues. One, you've got companies that have to pay a great deal more for their labor. I mean, there are people out there with the skills, and they know they have the skills, so they're saying, yeah, guess how much I'm going to cost. Then you've got companies that can't find them at all and end up having to change strategy, become more technology centered. People that run companies have always known that if you are predominantly relying on people, you can react to your ups and down seasons by ups and downing your labor force. When you don't have work, you let people go, you bring them on when you do have work. Well, if you invested in technology and machines, you're stuck with them. You're going to be paying for them if you're having a down year or not. So it takes some of that flexibility out of your management. So that's the reason we're worrying about the cliff. That whole idea of the 2030 recession to beat all recessions came out of ITR, the Bolio brothers, and they would make it clear saying it's not so much that we're guaranteeing a recession, we're just saying yep, those boomers are going to leave. We see 25,000 people added to Social Security every day.
Thank you. Let's see. Looks like we've got another question here. What is different now versus the early U.S. years, the Hamilton Plan, when we had no income tax and the U.S. government was funded primarily by tariffs?
Yeah, that was some of the conversation back in the very beginning. Tariffs are a way to make some money. The challenge is that it kind of distorts your economic growth because tariffs are something, any tax is something that people try to avoid. So if you're getting hit with a tariff, you look for alternatives. You know, you're going to produce someplace where you don't get hit with the tariff. You're going to find alternatives to it. It's not as reliable. The income tax was seen as something that was more predictable and governments can count on it. Doesn't mean that it's foolproof. I mean, the income tax is another thing that we do everything we can to minimize and try not to lose as much money as possible. And we know that it distorts. We know that people deliberately take less money as an income so they don't get into a different tax bracket. I mean, you know, that's the accounting world is well aware of that. So there's no perfect way to handle revenue increasing. A lot of countries have become a lot more dependent on things like VAT taxes and sales taxes. And they sort of look at that as well. A sales tax could be very high, but it's also a choice. If you don't want to pay the tax, don't buy the thing. I mean, the Germans have gone that way. They used to have very high income tax. They lowered it and said, no, we're going to tax the things that the rich people buy. We've tried to tax their income, and then they kind of dodge it one way or the other. But if we tax their expensive car, well, they're rich. They're going to buy the car anyway. What's the fun of being rich if you're not buying a Mercedes? So we just tax the heck out of the Mercedes and the watch and all the other things. So it kind of gives you the illusion of choice.
Great. Thank you. Got another one here. What are the three main contributing factors to lower workforce participation rates post-COVID?
Yep, the three that are standing out, and it's really number one, accounts for almost all of it, is the retirement. The fact that people reach a point in life where they don't have to work and they retire. Number two is the growth of the gig economy. We don't really know how to handle this yet, and it is something that's fairly new, but you now have people that are working in an environment they don't even describe themselves as employed. If you ask somebody who is doing Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, do you have a job? They will frequently say no. And what do you do? Sure, you have a job. You're in that car every day. It's not a real job. I don't have a boss. I don't have to drive. I don't have to do anything. It's up to me. So we don't even know how quite to count them. But a lot of Gen Z is in that world. If they start to look at their options and say, well, I can take a minimum wage job working at a fast food plant, or I can Uber, I can Lyft, I can DoorDash. Why would I go, you know, I'll do whatever I want. The third thing that's accounting for workforce participation declines are people that are somehow finding a way to survive without a steady income. This can be family money, it can be relying on government handouts, it can be a whole series of of informal economy arrangements. We don't have as much of that as many countries in the world have, but again, for the Gen Z generation, that's more common. So a lot of the workforce participation is either boomers retiring or Gen Z that's just like, you know, I don't want to play the normal economic game.
Right. Thank you. All right. Looks like that's all the questions at this point. So again, Dr. Kuehl, thank you for your time and insight today, and thank you to everyone that was able to get on the call and join us today. We really appreciate it. We have shared Dr. Kuehl's contact information in the chat as well, and so feel free. He's gracious enough has offered that. Feel free to reach out to him if you get any other specific questions, or also you can always reach out to ATA as well at info@ata.net. We'll share that contact information. We'll also share the meeting materials after the session as well. So hope everyone has a great rest of your day and rest of your week. Dr.
All
Kuehl,
right.
again, thank you for helping us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.